Hello, my name is Ivan Richmond, the author of a book called The Religion of Good. In my book, I explore why I think it's so hard for many people today to think clearly about ethics and what we can do about it. I have come to understand that we are currently in an ethics crisis. My solution is a spiritual one, but it's not religious, and I'm not pushing any religion or any ethics on anyone. It's about how you can figure out ethics for yourself. In the last 3 videos on my series on the ethics crisis, I discussed why I think neither dogma, nor reason, nor intuition work as valid means to coming to an ethical conclusion. If you want to hear what I have to say about that, you can see my videos in the series, links below. Okay, so in this 4th video, which is the final video in this particular series, I'm going to share my own dark night of the soul in going through the ethics crisis and how I came out the other side. How I fundamentally changed my approach to the whole problem, and a glimpse of the conclusions that led me to write my book. Stay tuned. So, when I got to the place that I was in my thinking about this, I felt devastated. Okay, I had never really thought that religious dogma worked in the first place. But now I didn't think that reason or intuition worked either. And yet, I couldn't go with moral relativism. It was like there was this one time when I had this really bad back spasm. I jumped out of my couch in pain, and then it hurt to stand up. So I sat down and it hurt to sit down. I jumped up and it hurt to jump up, and like there was no place in which I was out of pain until I like curled up on a ball. It was that painful. And this long dark night of the soul that I went through was that kind of pain, because I felt like we need ethics. We need to figure out how we ought to behave, and moral relativism just doesn't cut it. So all this happened right around the time the pandemic hit, and I dutifully sheltered in place in order to not spread the disease, because I thought that was the ethical thing to do, and I still think that was the right thing to do. And as it so happened, there was a silver lining to the pandemic for me, which is that I had a lot of time to think about all of this. I wasn't able to transcend this brick wall I had hit until I changed my entire mental approach. It took a complete overhaul of the approach that I was using and acquiring a new way of thinking in order to realize what I would eventually come to realize. Fortunately, my spiritual training kicked in, and I came to see that I had a ready resource. I came to see that the problem was trying to use propositional logic in the first place. Now, that is not to say that reason doesn't have its place, but put a pin in that. I had long ago crossed dogma off my list for reasons I've explained in the first video. I had come to reason that reason doesn't work for reasons I explained in the second. And again, we can use reason generally to show that reason does not work in a specific case, okay? Like Alistair McIntyre did. As for intuition, which I covered in the third video, there's a sense to which it has the same problem as dogma, in that it has the potential to be dogma that comes from yourself instead of from Scripture. In other words, you have an intuition about what's good, you take it as fact, and then proceed with your axioms. What I needed was an approach that didn't rely on a logical series that looks like A, therefore B, therefore C, but that also didn't suffer from just jumping to conclusions. Fortunately, in spirituality, we often think of spiritual practices in empirical terms. Growing up Zen, it was a widespread idea I heard from the adults that the university academics who studied Buddhism didn't really understand Zen because they didn't meditate. You need to meditate, you see, or some other technique that gets you into the Zen state in order to understand the Zen state. Deductive logic is what mathematical proofs use. It starts out with a certain set of axioms, which are assumed to be true, and then the logic is carried forward until a conclusion is reached. However, in empiricism, which is used in the scientific method, an experiment is performed to find out how things work. What is observed is considered to be true about the matter being experimented on. Take, for example, gravity. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle thought that heavy objects fall faster than light objects. Feathers fall faster than rocks, after all. Well, he didn't know about air resistance. Then Galileo came along and started dropping objects of different weights off of a tower, and noting that they always hit the ground at the same time. This disproved Aristotle. Aristotle's mistake was using logic to deduce the facts of gravity from his basic understanding of reality just from living in it, which is that he saw feathers fall slower than rocks. Because he had never tried dropping different objects off a tower, he never got a chance to observe that, as Galileo realized, small rocks, or whatever, fall at the same speed as large rocks. And feathers are an exception to the rule. Galileo's early use of scientific empiricism and experimentation, on the other hand, allowed him to see something that disproved Aristotle's logical but incorrect conclusion. Many of us feel that spiritual experiences work in a somewhat similar way to empiricism. The difference is that the data from the experiments is ineffable. You see, so that is, there aren't words to describe it. You need to experience the Zen state in order to understand Zen, but the Zen state is ineffable. You can't speak of it because as soon as you do, you leave the Zen state. To quote Alan Watts, reality itself is not a concept. Reality is, and we won't give it a name. This is very difficult to explain to anyone who hasn't experienced Zen. But you can write poetry about it, you can make art about it, etc. For example, the Heart Sutra, seminal to Zen Buddhism, is arguably a text that makes much, much more sense when you have experienced the Zen state. That's why I think so much Zen poetry and art seems so mysterious to Westerners. Most Westerners haven't practiced Zen. I didn't really understand even that I had fundamentally switched my approach to contemplating the question of ethics until the editing process of my book, when a coworker turned me on to a video series by a cognitive scientist at the University of Toronto named John Vervaeke. The video series is called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Dr. Vervaeke discusses how there are different types of knowing. Propositional knowing, an example of which would be Aristotle's erroneous logic that heavy objects fall faster than lighter ones, is the form of knowing best known in the West because it was emphasized so much in the Enlightenment. That is, when we typically say logic or reason or something like that, very often, according to him, if I understand him correctly, we are talking about propositional knowing. But there are other types of knowing. The type of knowing that I think I've been talking about with spirituality, if I understand Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, is participatory knowing. This is the type of knowing that happens because you participate in something. By participating in various forces in our mind via meditation, we get a better feel for them. By participating in a ritual, we explore something sacred. John gives us the example of a Lady Justice ritual. By doing a ritual involving Lady Justice as a mythic figure, we get a handle or grip on what justice feels like. He thinks that participatory knowing is the most appropriate type of knowing for getting a handle on an ineffable mystery. And he uses a cup, but I'll use this Zen bowl. He talks about different touch points, right? And I hope that I've done justice, speaking of justice, that I've done justice to what Vervaeke has to say, that I haven't gotten that wrong, because I am a layman. But I think it's a very interesting and worthwhile video series. Suddenly, I had the words to describe what I was grasping to explain in my book. I had already realized that goodness is an ineffable mystery. The most appropriate way to know it is not through propositions, but through participatory knowing. None of us knows for sure what it means to be good, but we can all get touch points on it through spiritual practices. This might just give us the wisdom I alluded to in my video on intuition. In other words, that we need enough wisdom and insight to gain the right sense of what's relevant in our ethical quandaries in order to get a feel of what goodness is like. But the trick is that we cannot, repeat not, go back to the wars of religion, where different religions insist that their way is each the one right, true, and only way. And I see this happening right now. Our society has become entrenched in ideology. So it feels like we're in kind of like a war of ideology right now. Any ethical solution must be universalist and resist ideology. So I cannot preach any religion or even any ethical system. That would only exacerbate the ethics crisis. The best way forward, I realized, was to enter the public forum and engage my fellow human beings as interlocutors in dialogue. For dialogue is the best way for the blind people to figure out that the elephant is, in fact, an elephant. We must have the humility, therefore, to admit that we don't know, we only feel. From there, I can suggest that the contemplation of all of us as one is the way to clarify our ethical intuitions. The trick is that you can use your religion and I can use mine, or you can use, not at all, spiritual practices if you don't have a religion. You only need spirituality, in other words, to do this. So I'm pushing nothing, but I do have some ideas. I'd ask that you read my book before deciding whether or not you agree with me, because I go into much more detail there. In other words, I can only cover so much in YouTube videos. But that's basically the concept of my book. I've now through about chapter 3 with it, and the rest of the book, chapters 4 through 10, are on developing your spiritual practices and whatnot. So I'd ask you, instead of using propositional reasoning to try to figure out logically whether or not what I propose will work, that you test my practices much as a scientist would and see if you think they work. And please do so iteratively, that is, do them multiple times regularly, daily, weekly, monthly, something like that. Do them for an extended period of time. I mean, if I were going to really ask for my dream, it would be that people do some sort of practice at least daily or weekly for an entire year and see if that helps clear up their ethical thinking by shining the light of wisdom and insight. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, be good, everyone.